Here is an orange ink by Lamy Bronze.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
I don't know why an idea of this being a brown, but that's what the idea I had going into this, but I was wrong. Orange it is. Thankfully, there is a bunch of tone variation to choose from, because I do find one of the tones just a bit too light to comfortably deal with too much. Orange inks don't tend to often shade much, and this is an exception, as I find it shading fairly often, even in its darkest tone. While I cannot see myself happily using a bottle of this, I do think if you have a bottle, you can easily choose a pen that will put down a tone that's very usable and very pleasant.
The pen for today is
a Sailor, my first pen.
All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the lightest tone that we're going to get on the page, and I'm hoping it's dark enough to come through on camera. There is no feathering, there is no spread. Well, of course, there is some shading when we look at well, of course, on the second line. The W shows some lighter and darker tones with it. It lightens up a bit on the E, gets very dark on the first L and on the first part, or on the downstroke of the second L, where of goes lighter to darker. Course, starting as a nice mid-tone, does get a little bit darker at the E, darker at the R, lighter at the S, darker at the E again. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. There is no feathering, there is no spread as a tone. It's very red and orange leaning. It's a wet pen doing this, so it comes across like an orange leaning red, not unpleasantly. It's not bothering me in what I'm seeing. It's just not really a perfect go-to tone. Bothering to shade, it does. When you look at bothering on the second line, you see the downstroke of the B is much darker than the rest of the B. The O is light. The TH is very dark, nice mid-tone on the ER, IN, and the downstroke of the G gets very dark. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, bit darker than it was with the soft fine. Nice tone here, nice orange going on with no feathering and no spread. When you look here at the look here, you see there's a very minor tone shift in what's going on. The look, the L and the K are slightly darker than the O's. And on the here, for the most part, it's the same tone. The R gets a little bit lighter. So there is some shading that's going on. It's just very subtle in its steps for that shading. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, much nicer tone that we have on the page, really showing a very nice orange with no feathering, with no spread. It makes it apparent that it does shade. Look at makes on the first line, that the M starts lighter, gets much darker at the end of the M, lightens up a bit into the AK. The E is very dark, and the S shows both lighter and darker tones. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 1 milliliter of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, much more readable on the page, really much more usable on this paper. It still does not feather, it still does not spread. When you can get on with the shading here, look at get on with on the second line. The G is lighter at the top, darker at the bottom. The E is light, and the T is a darker mid-tone, where on is very mid-tone through, with starts lighter, gets darker all the way through to the H. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, really looking like more of a red here than an orange. There's no feathering and there is no spread. I wish it could help shading, and it is shading, but not a ton. Look at could on the first line. It's mostly a mid-tone. The U lightens up a bit. The L gets very dark. Same with that D. It really does that very well. Looking at really on the second line, where it starts lighter, works its way darker at the L, light at the top of the Y, dark at the bottom of the Y, though all of it is still very much looking like a red. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine nib, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, and you had to know about the shading. Look at had no on the first line. There is very little. I mean, we can spot a few areas that it does shade, like that on the third line. Part on the second line goes lighter to dark. It's not really a standout shading in that's happening, but it is present. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium, a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread, and we get just a bit of shading. Not shading as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, which is not a surprise in itself, but the shading when we look at, for instance, when on the second line, if the W's a tad bit darker than the HE and the N quite a bit darker, he on the bottom part of the he, both on the first and second line, it's darker but lighter on the top part. I think they heard about shading when we see heard, where it starts lighter, gets a little darker at the A or at the AR, beginning of the D, lightens at the top of the D, dark at the bottom of the D. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, a bit more readable, but not really pleasant with the tone of this paper. There's no feathering and there is no spread. There is some shading. When you look at down the stone on the first line, you see the top of the D into O is much darker than the rest of down. The is a nice shifting between darker and lighter midtones. In stone, the S is lighter, the T is darker, lightens up at the O and E at the end. One idea. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, definitely being a red here. There is no orange lean to this ink until the very end, those last two words that you'll probably just miss, but everything's really coming across as red, with no feather, with no spread, with no shading. It's a nice red there if this were red. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. A little bit darker, I think, in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine, though is not as nice on the page as a result of this particular paper. With no feathering, with no spread, it does shade not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, which really wasn't very much. The best we can really see is fireworks on the first line. In the dot of the I and the E are a bit darker, same with the K and the S, but for the most part, this is a fairly even tone of orange with only a handful, very, very light sprinkling of shading. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. There we were looking for shading at there we were on the first line. The top of the T is lighter, it gets darker at the bottom. Now, same happens with the H. It's lighter at the top and darker at the bottom, and it holds some of that darker tone through the ERE at the end. Were starts lighter, works its way to very dark at the E. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. This tone with the quad rule that's here really makes the ink kind of, your writing kind of disappear on the page. I really see the quad rule more than I see the ink itself. There is some shading to be discovered by looking at discovered on the second line. The I is a little bit darker, the dot of that is a little bit darker, the downstroke of the C, but finding the shading means you have to look at it. None of it's yelling at you. Look at yelled on the second line. The E is the darkest, or on the third line, the E is the darkest letter of that word, and even that is not really standing out well. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, little bit darker, just a tad darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. Good heavens, we get some shading when we look at good heavens on the second line. The top of the G is very dark. It lightens up at the bottom swoop into the O's, which stay lighter through the D, and the downstroke of the D gets much darker. And heavens starts darker at the E, and Evan lightens up a little bit till the S comes along and it gets just a bit darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with lighter than it was with the wet fine, tad bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. Still having issues with the quad rule because of the tone of this paper. It's really not standing on its own with a quad rule. No feather, no spread. You know it. It is shading about as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. Look at know it on the second line. The KN is lighter than the OW, and the it darker than the no. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. And before you ask, if you look at before on the second line, the name, not the word before, there's almost no shading going on here, and there's not a lot of shading that's happening. You see how most of the word is one tone and the R is a bit darker. It's not that it doesn't have any shading. When you see haven't on the third line, it starts as a midtone, really lightens up in the center, gets to that midtone again at the T, and that's where we're getting less shading than the Clairefontaine. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman, their number 16. Here is Diamine Orange.
Here is Kaweco Sunrise Orange.
Here is Pelican Mandarin. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. The quad rule is really still working against this ink, and its darkness just isn't there. It's not really something I would want to see a student using, but there is no feathering and there is no spread. The shading that does show up is very small, nothing to gasp at. Look at gasps on the second line, and you see the P is a slight bit darker. Same with the D, a slight bit darker. You find only a letter here and there that are that little bit darker, but nothing special. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get followed immediately by surprise at this point to talk about shading. Looking at followed immediately. Now the F starts very dark, it lightens up into the O quite a bit, actually showing some of those orange undertones. The L's get a bit darker into the O, the W-E-D a bit darker, and immediately after that, the I is darker than the M's. The E gets darker again, lightens up into the D, stays lighter till you get to the telly at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with almost nothing for shading. There's a couple of spots that occur, mostly your dots of I's, periods, commas, that sort of thing, but not really a whole lot. You can see it a little bit with that on the first line where you get some mid and darker tones or trees underneath it, but for the most part, this is just there. The ink itself to me is lost, to reiterate that, in the quad rule, really working against how dark this ink is. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading that shows up at moments, just moments really, more than it did on the medium, nowhere near as much as it did on the Clairfontaine. Look at interested on the third line. You see that it's lighter, and the downstroke of the T is just a tad bit darker, the tiniest bit darker. It lightens up again till the second R, where it starts to get darker and shows some of the red, lightens up a bit until the downstroke of the D. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, but I would discourage you from using this as a student note taker.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Bookbinder's Blue Racer Snake. Here is a brown ink by KWZ Brown No. 3. Here is a green ink by Noodler's General of the Armies.
Here is a purple ink by Tasha Murasaki.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, much more usable as a tone in from what we've had before, and having no lines and having no quad or any of that is helping this ink. Now, there is some tiny feathering and there is some tiny spread. Neither of those are an issue because of how light this ink is. I would have to zoom way in for you to really see it. There are some moments of shading that go on, but they're not what you tend to really worry about when it comes to copy paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, about as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather much more noticeably than it did with the soft fine, and that's because of this being a much wetter pen. You see the feathers a lot on had on the first line, or they on the second line. The spread is also helping this ink, in this case, be more visible on the page. So I think the wet fine is actually doing very well, even with the feathering and the spread that's occurring. It does manage to shade some. Now, the shading is showing off some of the orange tones that this ink has, which is funny to say because it's an orange. It's mostly coming across as red with orange undertones. It's a good thing that's happening. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, darker than it was on the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. A very nice orange tone on the page. It does feather fairly regularly, but very small. Same with the amount of spread. I think what we have here on this paper, this ink is a good combination for this nib, because all of the normally bad things, feathering and spreading, are helping it out, though there's no shading at all. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. Yes, the feather and the spread, again, actually help how well this ink can be seen. They don't really detract from what I'm seeing. There's no shading going on, which is generally a good news when you talk about copy paper. Looking at the back of the page, now the ink got very deep into the paper, especially with that wet fine. I don't think writing back here would be a good idea. You might be able to get away with it if you wanted to. I wouldn't. A lot of ghosting. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath, which is a huge positive for this.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine is a tone too light for me to generally care for, with a noticeable amount of shading, just noticeable. The wet fine is very dark, to the point of being red with orange undertones. So yes, it shades. It's red, not orange. The medium is a bit darker than the soft fine and shades much better than the soft fine, but the tone is still generally just a bit too light for me. While the broad is darker than the medium, it does shade better than anything else in the bunch. So I go for the medium flow broad because of the color and the shading. Now, for editing notes where I tend to be writing smaller between the lines kind of things, I'm going with the wet fine to darken it up. I understand it becomes more of a red than an orange, but that's a trade-off that I take.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you're not subscribed, I would invite you to do so now.